Okay, and let's get started here. Lance, you can sit at the big table if you like. Okay, good. And thank you all very much for joining us this morning. My name is Steve McMenamin. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is part of the continuing series of the Greenwich Roundtable. Our topic this morning, Building Returns in Infrastructure, is a continuation of Ryan's excellent series on the strategy. And the last session he organized here on planes, trains, and automobiles in 2009. And today our speakers are the very best in their class. I'll briefly introduce them after I say this. Our speakers' views are their own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Roundtable, its trustees, or its staff. So having gotten that all out of the way, Mark Florian leads the global energy and power infrastructure team at BlackRock with $3.7 billion under, which were created and built at First Reserve, the legendary private equity firm in the energy sector. And a small historical note, Bill McCauley sat on this dais in 1998 with a guy named Andy Fastow. And boy, those are the days. Look what happened. In 2008, Mr. Florian started the power infrastructure business at First Reserve. Before that, Mark was a partner at Goldman Sachs' corporate investment banking division and a member of the investment committee for Goldman's infrastructure partners. Sitting next to Mark is Michael Korengold. He's the chief executive of Enhanced Capital Group, a real asset investment firm based in New York, as well as serving on that firm's investment committees and board of directors. At Enhanced Capital, he lectures extensively on capital formation programs and has testified before state legislatures and other governmental institutions on related issues. Before that, Michael practiced law for 7 years in New Orleans and Minneapolis, with an emphasis on mergers and acquisitions and financing transactions. He also clerked at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And standing in for Glenn Youngkin, thank you very much, Peter Taylor is here from the Carlyle Group in Washington, D.C. Pete is the co-head of Carlyle Global Infrastructure Opportunity Fund and is based in Washington. Before Carlyle, Mr. Taylor was a Hastings Infrastructure Fund for 15 years, where he focused on real assets, global investments, and he focused on sourcing new investments, divestment opportunities, and portfolio company outcomes. He's responsible for overseeing a number of Hastings investments in recent years, Freeport LNG and the Port of Newcastle and Sydney desalinization plant. And finally, the moderator of the Greenwich Roundtable today is Ryan Dartnell. Although Ryan needs no introduction, I will say that he's led most of our GR sessions that were pound for pound our best moneymakers. And more, that's true. And more recently, Ryan is now the founding partner of Paxos Key Holding and an advisor for SHL Capital, where he most recently was the chief investment officer and chief executive. Ryan, she's all yours.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's nice to be here. Thank you to our speakers for coming to educate us on building returns in infrastructure. I'd say this was motivated initially by Trump's big announcement about the $1 trillion infrastructure program and the tremendous market reaction. But as we thought about it, it was also very much motivated by the interest we had in finding something defensive, maybe tangible, with recurring cash flow, things that could get us through the next cycle whenever that comes. Finding that safe, elusive, safe yield. Super happy that we have three distinguished and veterans seasoned in infrastructure. Pete stood in this morning literally at 7:30. I got an email at 7:20, I think, saying that Glenn was stuck with equipment problems, and such is the power and the breadth of Carlyle that they had the co-head here before I got here this morning, so thank you. So the perspective from Pete is managing a global fund, and it's lucky that he has a lot of experience in Australia, where the Australians have had a very developed infrastructure sector for many years. Mark, as we've heard, is an energy and power specialist. He was at Goldman Sachs for 23 years before First Reserve, so he's got just a tremendous amount of experience. The energy sector and the power sector are huge, and I'm hoping that with the dislocation that we've seen in certain parts, he's going to be able to unearth and illuminate on some of the compelling ideas in the sector. And lastly, Michael is a tax specialist. He does tax credit investing. And I'm sure he'll tell us how that works, but he's also going to have insights into how tax credits might play a part in the incentivization of private capital coming into the yet-to-be-seen infrastructure program. So with that as the setup, I'll hand it over to Pete. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Ryan, and appreciate everybody's time this morning. And it was a fortuitous phone call that came through at 6 a.m. as I was sitting on the shuttle. And I think what it was a testament to was that the country is in desperate need of some infrastructure improvement. So Glenn asked me to... there's a couple of interesting stats I can come up with today. But so Glenn asked me to cover a couple of things he wanted to talk about today. And I think first and foremost, and I get asked this a lot, both in the United States and obviously in Australia where I started, and in Europe where I've also done a lot of work over time, what is the status of the Trump infrastructure plan? What's coming out of DC? There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of tweets. In fact, it's really interesting for an infrastructure guy to see most of this policy announced on Twitter. That's a real challenge. But, I think but there were three big things I want you to take away from today. One, if you're looking for returns, what we have observed and continue to observe, and I think my fellow industry participants here would agree, is that is in value-add infrastructure, not core. This is not about clipping coupons. This is about how do you take an infrastructure business, improve it, improve the outcomes to customers and the communities. The second, well, notwithstanding my accent, I do live in Washington, D.C., and I've spent 8 of the last 12 years in the United States. And the US is by far the largest opportunity for infrastructure of an investable nature, probably outside the Asian emerging market. That's the second point. And the third is actually this is really hard. And I've done this, I've been doing this now coming up 21 years. This whole industry started off on a financing front. We were helping the federal government in Australia avoid bankruptcy in the mid-90s by taking its airports off its hands, various state governments. But that's evolved, and if you think about, and most of you will have read Jeremy Corbyn's recent comments in the UK, infrastructure's had to move from being a financing to very much a service or outcome to users in the communities in order to both justify the returns and justify the role that private capital has in public infrastructure. So they're the big three takeaways today. And please, if there are any questions, it makes for a much more interesting conversation. But if I go back and dig into those three just a little more, and we talk about these as value add versus core. So one of the reasons I was on the 6 a.m. shuttle coming up here today, and a number of you will be pleased about this, is that most of the terminals at JFK and the Port Authority and the state are thinking about how do they redo that infrastructure. We were sitting down meeting with a group, scheduled to sit down with a group of airlines later this morning to improve it. And when you think about a terminal, most of us are used to just going there, you've now got your pass electronically, and you're throwing your bag in, you're kind of walking through, hopefully you get through TSA quickly, you get through the other side, you get on your plane, and you go, thankfully that's over. But when you get outside this country, what you look at is an end-to-end service of how can we make sure that customer experience from the moment you arrive at the airport to the moment you get on that plane is less troublesome, you're more appreciative of what's happening there. And so what we find when we look at things like transportation infrastructure, focusing on delivering a good customer outcome actually helps, one, the customer response, but the second and most important point is you then have a propensity to spend. And the interesting stat I throw up for people, on a commercial revenue basis, US airports only outperform Africa on the amount we all spend at airports. We're about 2/3 of what they get in Europe. We're about half of MENA, and we're about 75% of what they achieve in the Asia-Pacific region. Our operations in the US are some of the most inefficient. It's really interesting when you deal with companies that specialise in airfield operations, and they too look at the US like emerging markets. Who has caught the red eye from the West Coast, sat at JFK or Dulles, waiting for the wing walkers and everybody to guide you in? We've all done it, right? It's about $65 a minute when one of those planes is sitting there. You do enough flights a day and you put up enough minutes apart from everybody else's time, there's a lot of operational improvements that you can pass through to airlines and improve margins for airports. So everybody thinks of infrastructure as kind of clipping coupons. Infrastructure is about what are the customers that you have, how do you deliver those outcomes. And going back to my original Jeremy Corbyn comment, I was on a World Economic Forum panel in London a couple of weeks ago talking about asset recycling, which a lot of publications, I did a lot of the asset recycling deals in Australia in recent years. And I said too often this industry falls back on its contracts with government, it falls back on its regulatory regimes, and it says, I'm complying with those, what's the issue? Well, the issue these days is when a user, and I was coming up the I-95 this morning, and I was waiting to get stuck in that long jam as you go through the booths. And 10 years ago, a user would write an email if they felt like it. Today, you pull out your phone, you take a photo, and you put it up on one of the social media channels. So the issue Jeremy Corbyn's highlighting is infrastructure really needs to think about their customers. You need to deliver better outcomes to customers and communities. And by doing that, you'll both improve your margins and improve returns. And having lived through the global financial crisis in infrastructure, having a portfolio spread from airports, including Athens, which was a really interesting experience at the time, through water companies, everything else, by delivering those customer outcomes in to Ryan's point, defensive assets, it was a good experience. So I just wanted to dig a little bit into value add. It was at a natural entree, as you've heard me talk about, to US. So you've heard me talk about airports. Well, if you go into the middle of this country, there are 750 cities across this country that have combined sewer and outflow systems. And for those of you who don't know what they are, it's when you get when you get heavy rain, it happens a lot in the Midwest. You overload your sewage system with water, and you have raw sewage basically going down waterways. You'll actually see, if you observe accident, emergency, and hospital admissions, you get a spike that coincides with weather events. Kansas City does not have the $2.8 billion necessary to pull up its almost 2,800 miles of pipe and relay it to separate out the systems. The great thing is, if you think about the way that technologies come through, like Uber and everything else, to improve our existence, technologies can now be combined with infrastructure to deliver lower cost outcomes than just physically replacing the infrastructure. So the US is an enormous emerging market. The thing we like about this market is a lot of the infrastructure is already there. You have to redo it. You have to improve it. There are naturally going to be challenges. I would say, notwithstanding the comment about the confusion that comes off whether there's an agenda out of Trump, or is it coming out of Secretary Chow, is it coming out of Chairman Schuster's committee on the Hill, what we are finding is this real engagement on bringing forward the US infrastructure market is coming out of the cities and the county executives. They're not waiting. In fact, most of them are hoping that DC does not mess it up, but they're not waiting for a master bill. There's funding that needs to come out of the federal government to parts of the country. But by and large, what we're finding is that as we engage with cities and counties, they're ready to engage. What they are looking for from us is how do we bring innovation to deliver better outcomes to their constituents tomorrow than they have today. It's not just about financing. The second comment I'd just make on the US is we find, interestingly enough, it does not matter which side of the political divide a particular city or county sits on. We're finding equal take-up, and the key point and what they look at is what can you bring that improves that outcome. Obviously, the financial is important, but what you can bring. And then the third point I wanted to tack in, and then, Ryan, I'm happy to stop for questions. The third point I really wanted to tack in is that this
Maybe I'll just interrupt you and ask a question now.
Yeah, go for it.
So could you describe a little bit more the interplay between yourselves and those city governments? What is it that you can provide them, and what do you need in return to provide them the finance?
So the first thing we always say is we're not here to provide the finance. And that's a really deliberate thing, because the issue we run into is they say, well, we can borrow tax-exempt muni finance really cheaply. And so we sit down, and I'm thinking of a recent discussion I had in the Midwest with the county executive, and they've got this combined sewer and outflow issue. They're under consent decree with the Environment Protection Agency because they're not in compliance with the Clean Water Act. And they would say, look, we need somewhere between $900 million and $1.5 billion of infrastructure. Their plan is about $1.5 billion. What we're saying to them in the conversation is, look, we're happy to bring a certain amount of physical infrastructure. We think the technology monitoring system we bring with it would cut down your capital spend. We're looking for a commitment to you for every gallon of water that you treat. We want so many cents per gallon. If we meet our performance standards, you pay that cents per gallon. If we don't meet our performance standards, we're at risk. And when you think about it from a private equity business, if we don't perform and deliver our products to customers each and every day, we don't have underlying portfolio companies. And that's a very different outcome. We're thinking about what is the outcome we've got to achieve so they meet their consent decree, what's an acceptable price that their customer, that their constituents will pay for additional cost for treatment of water. And in return for that, we obviously need a long-dated contract to provide that service. And as we experience, and I always look back at our period managing a portfolio during the global financial crisis, consumption of water, basic gas, basic electricity, all your essentials, including flying to Athens if you're a European, were things that just kept flowing. So hopefully that picks up your question. And the third part, and that picks the third part, which is really, this is not finance. No disrespect to our banks that operate in the US, but they often walk in and offer two options to cities. You can do a muni financing, or you can do a P3 availability. The market needs more than that. The market needs real operational improvement. You need the improvement that comes through terminals at airports. You need improvements that are coming through combined sewer systems. You need improvements that are coming through electricity grid. Obviously, Mark will pick up power and energy. There's improvements there. The importance of those improvements is you've got to reach out across a broad spectrum of operators and industry expertise. I was in a recent conversation with Munich Airport, and they've got this second terminal they've built, which tracks customer flows, and it's a real big play on big data. And they've been able to improve their turnaround times through security, queuing for boarding by the technology can track those flows. So there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of innovation. And so this is very different to when I started in infrastructure in the late 90s, which was if you could at least put together the cheque for government, they were in desperate need of balance sheet repair. So I'm going to pause for a question, but the big three, value add, US is a significant opportunity, and it's about bringing innovation and improvement, which drives EBITDA margin, EBITDA cash flows, and returns for investors.
Okay, I think we usually do questions at the end. Anybody have questions at this stage? Okay, so, yeah.
What you talked about being a little more elongated. How does the infrastructure investment compare to other private equity investments? What is your time horizon?
Yeah, we approach that on two components. We kind of see a transformation period, which is probably only just slightly longer than private equity, where you've really got to stand up, do the transformation in a 3 to 4 year period. Then you need the longer dated partners that'll take that kind of new infrastructure piece and own it for the duration. So the value add strategies are very much focused on the front end, kind of only a slightly longer time frame than private equity.
That second partner, the one who wants to hold it for a long period of time, what sort of returns does that? Who are those people, and what sort of returns do they expect?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something we think about on the way in. If you pick up part of Corbyn's question, Jeremy Corbyn's comments and others, capital formation from the perspective of acceptability locally is a key issue. When we were doing Sydney desalination that Ryan highlighted, probably the top bidder by 30% was Beijing Water. I said, the Premier of New South Wales, Mike Baird, rang me and he said, look, we're just not taking Beijing Water through to the next round. We need to make sure that they're an acceptable group of owners. Irrespective, we've got all the contractual controls. Page one of the newspaper will crucify us if there's not an acceptable capital formation, which leads me to the point that those longer-term owners we usually have an eye on as we're going in through the transformation stage. We will often bring them in as partners early on, let us control transformation, and then they stay on, they're a natural exit, and they fall into multiple broad buckets. Basically large pension funds, the insurers and the sovereign wealths. And we've seen a yield compression from them that's probably gone from a 10% yield requirement back in 2012, and I'll be generous to them now, I'll say they're down to 6 to 7%.
6 or 7?
Yeah.
And that's on an equity piece, or that's on all the,
That's just on their equity piece. That's how aggressive they've got on the equity piece. And the reason they have is and it's funny, I talked to a number of sovereigns, got a lot of relationships there. For them, they're looking at these assets, these businesses, once they go past the transformation stage, they're just looking at them as a proxy for kind of almost fixed income, so they've been chasing the yield down. Because as they say, even with some low loss, even with some loss ratio, they're better returns than owning European bonds.
And how levered is that? So is that like 75% levered and they own the 25% strip?
It's probably, depending on the project, you're anywhere from 40 to 50% levered through to about 60 to 70. You're trying to make sure you've got you can dividend through cash flows. And I think, having an eye to potential tax reform in this country as well, I think those, it'll kind of reinforce that capital structure view.
Great. This is nice to be digging in. Mark, as I mentioned, is going to talk about energy and power, and hopefully maybe also on the alternative, solar and other alternatives that are growing quickly. Over to you, Mark.
Great. Thank you so much for having us this morning. Interesting topic, one that we live and breathe every day, so it's a lot of fun for us to talk about it. Peter did a great job in talking about some sectors that are key in the infrastructure space, and key ones being public transportation, public utilities. There's another big slice that you alluded to in the space that we specialize in, which is energy, basic human need that we all have, that we use every day. And so maybe to step back, give you a sense for how we focus in the marketplace, and then I can go into a little bit about the energy industry, some of the massive changes that have happened and will happen, and then what can we do about it? How do we address that and try to create great returns for our investors? To give you a sense for what we do, we have a sector focus, first of all, energy and power. We think in terms of investable opportunities, the largest part of infrastructure overall, and an interesting sector to be in, one you really need to have a lot of specialization in to be successful. Second, in terms of returns, and this gets to what we try to achieve in terms of our funds returns, it's low to mid-teens with a lot of cash yield. Cash yield early and often. Give you a sense, our first fund has been delivering between 8 and 10% cash yields every year for the last 6-7 years. So we try to not only deliver that yield, but as Peter alluded to, also de-lever over time. So we have our cash flow, we de-lever, we pay dividends, and through the de-leveraging process, as well as what we can do in terms of operational enhancements, we try to create some growth on top of that yield. And then finally, we focus a lot on alpha. How do we generate alpha? The interesting thing about the energy sector is a lot of it's owned by the private sector. And so we spend our time talking to industry partners, big strategics in the space, where we use our capital, our know-how to try to help their businesses run better. Can we help them grow faster? Can we help them cut the cost of their infrastructure? Can we help them circulate capital out of lower returning assets into higher returning endeavors? If we can help them strategically, we can actually generate, we think, better returns for our investment. So that's a little bit about what we try to do. But let me take a step back and let's talk a little bit about the energy sector, which obviously since I'm in it, I think it's fascinating. You really need deep expertise and focus in the sector because there is a huge amount of relentless change in the sector. And there's changes in the regulatory environment, there's changes in technologies, and there's also massive capital costs that go along with it. So it's a tricky place to be. If you think about where we were 10 or 15 years ago, there were a bunch of rules of the road in terms of what was happening in energy. And some of these will almost seem silly today, but these are things that people really thought were the case. We had this thing called peak oil. We could only generate so much oil, and it was going to hit a peak in the next decade or two, and then it was going to decline forever. That is gone. The ability of the markets and players in the industry to find ways to create more commodity product to support the energy industry has been phenomenal. The change has been phenomenal. There is really no such thing as peak oil. at this point in time in terms of people's psyche in the marketplace. Another thing people are saying in the mid-2000s was the U.S. is declining producer of energy, and we're going to have to rely more and more and more on other parts of the world to help supply our energy. That completely changed in 2008 and 2009, not that long ago, where the U.S. has become now one of the largest producers of energy in the world, and not only is self-sufficient, but is exporting energy. Completely different than what people thought 10 or 15 years ago. A couple of other things that are interesting. Back, again, 10 years ago, there was a lot of thought that, for example, natural gas was a commodity that you could only use locally. It's in a gaseous state, you have to put it in a pipeline. Pipelines don't cross oceans. They don't go everywhere. And so you produce it, you use it locally. Well, now we have technology where we can freeze that to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, put it in a liquid form, put it on a tanker, send it anywhere in the world. The natural gas value chain from that globalization of that product, it creates huge infrastructure needs. Renewables, as you mentioned, Ryan, huge change there too. We've been investing in renewables since the beginning of our funds. At our first investments, you needed to have huge government subsidies to make renewables work. It's very expensive, intermittent, all kinds of issues. Now the cost curve for renewables has dropped in a massive way, such that renewables are very competitive in many, many markets. And using solar or wind or other renewables is not only cheap, as it becomes a bigger and bigger part of our power supply, it's a major disruptor to all the legacy power that we've been producing. So what can one do about all this? I mean, those are changes that happened kind of 2005 to today. There's going to be a lot of changes going forward. This is a market that's going to be constantly, relentlessly changing. So what do? Well, our goal is to provide stable income-producing investments that have the potential for some growth on top of it. First thing we do is what I call build a moat. So if I think of it in very simple terms, in terms of a cash flow model. First, you need stable revenues. What we do for our revenue model is we want contracted or regulated revenues from whatever business that we create. So give you a sense, in our current portfolio, average contract length for revenues is about 11 or 12 years. So we can see with our counterparties what those revenue streams are going to be for a long, long time. Second, we need controllable expenses. You can have a great revenue model, but if you can't control your expenses, for example, if you have a lot of commodity price volatility in your expense line, that's going to hurt your investments. So we need to be able to have investments we can see, control, and manage. And then third, when we use debt, it's long-term fixed-rate amortizing debt. So we can see what that stream of cash flow is going to look like for the next 10 or 15 years. So strong, stable revenues, controllable expenses, debt service that we can see for many years. You can see your dividend yield generated for many, many years into the future if you do that well. So that's building a moat. Part of building that moat is having that debt. When we set up our investments, in our term we're 15-year funds, we tend to underwrite to 10 to 12-year holds. And so as we de-lever the asset, obviously you're building equity value. So just through the capital structure we can create growth, but also we look for obviously operational improvements, ways to grow revenues as well over time with that stable base that we've created. So I think once you build a moat, you have to manage intensively, and then again, and then again. And what do I mean by that? These are heavy assets. There's a lot of bricks and mortar and steel that goes into a power plant or a road or airport or any of these infrastructure assets. Stuff breaks. And so in our example, we have engineering talent, operational expertise inside our fund, and we're not just financial investors. We have operating expertise to focus on working with our management teams to manage these assets well, and it's something that you have to just be relentless about over time. The final thing is be ready to pivot. So you have to plan for the worst. What if things do break? Do you have proper insurance? Do you have the right operating and maintenance processes? Are you doing the right things to manage this business to avoid something going wrong? Prepare for the worst and be constantly reevaluating your business in the context of the broader energy market to figure out where you sit. So like I mentioned, we have a 10 to 12-year hold. You've got to be on the operations all the time to make sure you do the right thing, and you have to look for opportunistic exits when they arrive. Let me give you one brief example, and then I'll turn it over to our other speakers. One example of a business that we focused on is a business we call Navigator. We started with a long-term contract from Shell to build an oil pipeline in West Texas. Why did Shell want this pipeline? Well, most of the oil in the region was being moved by truck, which is expensive, inefficient, environmentally not great either. If you put a pipe in the ground, you eliminate a lot of issues, and it's much more reliable, cheaper, and environmentally better. So we got a long-term contract from Shell to put a pipeline in. That gave us a very nice, stable return. We could see the revenues. We knew what the expenses were. We knew what our debt and debt amortization was going to be, so we knew we could generate dividends. But we also saw that there was an opportunity around that pipeline to expand around it, bring other customers in, grow the business. So a very stable, defensible base return with a possibility of some growth. In the end, 2.5 years later, we had built a 600-mile system. We had 18 customers, 24 contracts for revenue. Ultimately, we were approached by a large company, an MLP in the space, and they acquired it from us for a very nice return for our investors. We didn't expect to be out of it in 3 years, but this was a great opportunity for us to exit, so we were being opportunistic. We designed the whole business to be a stable, cash-flowing business for a long, long time with a 10 to 12-year hold, but we took advantage. We took advantage of being able to pivot. Anyways, I think it's a great space to invest in. We're super excited about it. There's a lot of opportunity. Lord knows we need better infrastructure in this country and other parts of the world. And I'll pause there and turn it over to the next speaker.
Sure, thank you. I had MLPs on my list of questions, and you just raised the subject. Obviously, they've been, not all, but many have been under quite a bit of stress. Could you give a sense of what you think the landscape is? What are the risks, and where do you see the possibility for opportunity in MLP land?
Sure. You know, the thing I think, and I think it's happening more now, but it hadn't happened until recently, is the MLP landscape is quite different in terms of the companies that are inside this universe we call MLPs. And I think the markets tended to homogenize a lot of these companies and say, oh, it's an MLP, it should have these characteristics. There are some companies in the space that have huge commodity price risk embedded in their businesses. There are some companies in the space that have virtually none and are more infrastructure-like in the sense that I define it, where they have long-term contracts. We did a convertible preferred into a company called Dominion Midstream, part of Dominion, big utility. That company has average contracts for revenues of like 15, 16 years, plus a lot of drop-downs that they can do of additional assets that they're developing that will even extend that revenue life. That's a great, solid, dividend-producing, with some growth business for a long, long time. There are other companies that don't have that contract cover, don't have visibility in terms of growth, and have there are a lot of, if they have contracts for revenues, they're dependent upon the price of oil and gas. And so I actually think there's been some great opportunities to invest in MLPs, particularly when there's volatility in oil and gas prices. That sector tends to get beat up, and everybody moves down in terms of pricing. And if you can buy the stable, strong, long-term companies like a Dominion.
You're allowed to name names.
Yeah, I'm not allowed?
You are allowed.
I am allowed?
You're encouraged.
I'm not trying to oversell, but I think, you know, with volatility in commodity prices, there are moments when this particular sector gets beat up, and that's a great investable opportunity, particularly if you're buying the really safe, stable companies in the space.
Right. Anybody have questions at this space? Peter?
You mentioned at the top that there are lots of surprises in this business, and we don't necessarily see what's coming.
Yep.
So it's interesting to see you building your moats the way you do. On the other hand, as you think about what we read about the cost curve in solar, for instance, coming down faster than maybe anybody knows.
Right.
In fact, it'll be more than just competitive. It's going to become the dominant source of energy supply, with decentralized systems, with all sorts of great things. What is the counterparty risk that you run into in this circumstance when you locked in your moat, supposedly?
Yep.
Where are the leaks in that type?
No, there's no doubt there's counterparty risk, and that's really the biggest risk in our portfolio is who are the people that are providing the revenues under contract, how solid are those contracts, will we get paid no matter what happens? And so what we spend a tremendous amount of time in doing is obviously looking at those counterparties, making sure that they're strong and solid for the long haul. We also look at the underlying economics of the business to that counterparty. And if those economics change, we want to be sure there's cushion against change. So, for example, one of the businesses that we've invested in is ships called FPSOs, floating production storage and offloading. Basically, these are big storage tanks that sit offshore oil fields. They collect the oil, and then shuttle tankers come out, collect the oil, and take it to shore. The interest in these are areas where either the water's too deep or you're too far away from shore to put in a pipe. We get long-term contracts on what's called a bareboat basis. That means essentially we take no operating risk. We're essentially leasing the ship to the major oil companies that have developed that field and are collecting that oil. One of the things we look at intensively, and this is part of the First Reserve heritage, is looking at that field, what are the economics of producing in that field, and how long will that production cycle go. So one asset we're looking at right now, we have a 7-year contract. We get all of our return inside that 7 years, assuming no residual value, so that's a very nice investment for us. But the field, we think, will produce for 12 years, even if oil goes down to $20. And so we think that set of counterparties are going to be very happy paying us if they can produce at $20 oil quite profitably. If the break even on that field was $60, even though we had a really good contract, we'd be worried about them trying to find some way to break it or to move away from it. So it's not just the counterparty in the contract, it's the underlying economics of what you're providing. It hopefully creates strength in the investment as well.
Okay. Pete, you probably overlap. Which is the area that you want to nip in and take Mark's business? Which is the most attractive?
So it's interesting. We have a lot of similar views to Mark on how do you build moats, etc., and approach. The area we see the biggest change comes off the question that just got asked. We see a lot of change coming through the electric industry. And when we see, if you stand back and look at it, and these are my views, not the views of this organisation, but when you look at it, historically utilities have made money by getting EPS growth by putting assets into rate base, right? And when we had, I had a house up in this part of the world, we had Hurricane Sandy. That was not a lot of fun, and you've had Hurricane Harvey, and you've had Hurricane Irma, and everything else. So two things that are happening in the electric industry we think are going to provide some interesting opportunities I think Mark and I will fight over in years to come, is that utilities are forcing up rates, forcing up asset base, forcing up consumer costs. And consumers are turning around and saying, well, hang on. And we had a major corporate come to us recently and said, in Hurricane Harvey, how come H-E-B stores were up and operating in Houston and our stores were all down? Why were we relying on the traditional grid? Why were we not connected with folks who can give us a microgrid that gives us resiliency, which means we can island, we can then shake off. If you look at your electric bill, there's this really interesting concept called peak demand that you pay for. How do we shave off peak demand? So I think there's some real structural challenges. I think we both agree that, and we do a lot of research through our broader private equity business on this, the drive down on unitary cost and everything across solar and storage, you're going to see this structural change. I can tell you, my kids at home, I've got 3 teenagers, and they're like, Dad, you're not doing fossil fuel generation anymore. I'm like, no, not anymore. Got out of that. But they're the consumers of the future, right? This whole consumer-driven piece, and they're going, we don't want bills going like that. Where's our resiliency? How come I can go to HEB and not something? Those challenges, I think there's a cost piece, there's a resiliency piece that it's going to come through. And this is the intersection of technology and innovation coming across to provide infrastructure services. So the one overlap that I think we'll run into Mark on out in the field is really across the electric industry as it goes through significant transformation. Yeah. And I think the grid industry globally is going to face some real challenges. When you look at unitary cost of putting storage, behind the meter and everything else, and you look at the efficiency that's coming out through solar and the like, it's just gone. I think one of the great things, I know this is going to sound sacrilegious, but actually the president coming out and saying, I'm not going to support tax credits. Sorry, Michael, I'm not going to support tax credits. People thought that was kind of going to be the end of some of the renewable industry. Well, what it's done is just brought forward further innovation and efficiency in the delivery. Consumers on the other side and corporates and going, we want it. So it's kind of taken that subsidy piece out. And if you look at what happened in Spain, would have been just after GFC, Mark, when Spain goes, we can't afford those subsidies anymore, to the question is kind of just put a line through it. We now see this whole industry going through real structural change over years to come. And we're looking for the opportunities where you can bring insight, innovation, technology to deliver better infrastructure, make better margins and returns than the traditional utility.
Okay, just one follow-up and we'll move. You mentioned the grid industry could be under real pressure. Do you have any particular sitting ducks that you might want to talk about?
Nope.
I do, maybe I'll just make one comment to add on to what Pete said.
I'm trying, guys.
I agree. Think about, and you brought this up as well, think about in Connecticut, you can get a subsidy to put solar panels on your roof. For the local utility now, your customer is becoming your competitor because you're generating your own electricity. I think the utility industry, as Pete said, is going to be under tremendous stress. A lot of big corporates are looking to generate, as Pete alluded to, their own distributed energy where they don't have to rely on the grid. It's a big shift. I think it's we have 8 or 10 going on, but this is one of the big shifts that's going on. And there is an investable opportunity behind that. So
great. As we were getting ready for the panel, we were talking outside about tax credits and who pays taxes and how certain really rich people don't pay taxes. And I mentioned that Michael has worked with Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway on abating their tax situation. So looking forward to Michael's comments now.
Yeah, so I'm not going to name names. So first of all, very happy to be here. I'm here with Sunil Khanna, and that's actually a good segue. Sunil's my connection to Greenwich, and Sunil was formerly at Berkshire Hathaway. That's how we knew each other, and is now a partner at Enhanced. And then as I was coming up here, we're right around the corner. We're partners in this business with Stone Point Capital, so I spend a lot of time in this neck of the woods. Maybe I'll give you 2 seconds on us, because I'm assuming that when you saw the 3 names on the agenda this morning, there was one that you probably didn't know quite as well, and that's Enhanced Capital. So while I'm going to talk about tax credits today, and in terms of how they can play a role in infrastructure and play a role in public policy finance in general, we're looking at tax credits as just one piece of different types of incentives to try to create a way to bridge the gap for projects where there's a public policy objective, and on its own, whether it's because the costs are still too high or whether it's just non-economic on its own, there's some sort of subsidy, and that subsidy can take the form of low-cost leverage. There are government guarantee programs, and then tax credits. And when we talk about tax credits, we also should remember that we're not just talking about federal tax credits, because states are quite competitive in terms of how they utilize state tax credits to try to incentivize behavior to take place in their states versus nationwide. So that's where Enhanced Capital focuses. We've been around for nearly 20 years. We actually got our start focused in state economic development programs to go invest in underserved areas around the country where states felt like they needed to diversify their economy and needed outside capital to do so, and found that tax credits were a way to incentivize private asset managers to come to places like Alabama or Louisiana. And we have a big office still in New Orleans that covers a lot of those underserved markets. In the intervening 20 years, there's just been a proliferation of tax credits. So we're talking about solar, and we should talk a little more about that as we drill down. But certainly people are familiar with affordable housing, solar, low-income community investing in general, and then the rehabilitation of historic buildings. Those are the primary federal tax credits. And when you think about affordable housing, which is just the best known one, that's sort of the simple case for tax credits. If you're a developer or you're an investor, you're going to build market rate housing, because why would you build affordable housing? And the reason is because the government will give you an incentive to bridge that divide, to make it worth your while. And so talk about costs coming down in solar. That's a case where you're hopefully, if you're the government, you're creating an incentive that's a temporary incentive, and you're weaning the market effectively off of the subsidy over time. It's exactly what's happened. Costs have come down. Having nothing to do with tax reform, the solar tax credit that's in place was already scheduled to step down. It's a 30% tax credit today, and it's scheduled to step down to 10%. And we'll see. I'll talk about tax reform in a sec in terms of what may happen. But that's exactly what the government is hoping. That's a successful program. You prime the pump with some sort of subsidy, whether that's a tax credit or other incentive, and then hopefully it becomes economic. We as a firm tend to play down market, certainly down market from these guys, but down market in general, where there's a less efficient market. And one of the things that you see is that, and solar is a good example, utility scale solar today makes sense without a subsidy. People are happy to still take the subsidy as long as it exists, but those deals work. If you go down market, if you're looking at smaller C&I, residential, community solar, which is sort of a fast-growing part of the solar business, a lot of those deals still do require some sort of subsidy and likely to be around for a while. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of walk through how tax credits work in general. We obviously don't know, whether tax credits will be a component of an infrastructure plan. I guess we don't even know if there's going to be an infrastructure plan. So maybe start there. But we're seeing a lot of activity. I mean, there is a tax credit bill that's been introduced that would create a large infrastructure tax credit program modeled on some of the existing programs. So I think it is worth going through how these programs work. And then we're also seeing states get aggressive and introduce infrastructure tax credits where, again, specific state projects that might be too small to otherwise make sense without a subsidy, they've created programs that would do so. In general, the way to think about tax credits is it's a way to participate for private investors, and in this case, tax-paying investors. It's a way to participate in these asset classes in a different way, with a different risk and return profile, and really a different part of the capital structure. So I thought maybe it's worth just kind of walking through I know it's early morning, so we won't get too into the tax specifics, but it's actually fairly straightforward. A tax credit is usually just a dollar-for-dollar offset against a tax that you owe to the government. So it's not an above-the-line deduction. You don't have to think about your corporate rate. There are some aspects to tax credits that can. But in general, this is, I owe the government $1 million. I can take that $1 million, and instead of paying my tax bill in April, I can put it into these projects and generate a return. So it's converting a known tax liability into a yielding asset. When you think about that, that's a fairly powerful concept. As we often joke, it's the only form of aggressive tax planning where you're not adversarial to the government, because the whole point of these programs is that the government is creating them to try to incentivize private capital investment to fulfill some sort of public policy that they've determined is worthwhile, and the only way to do that is to get private capital in. So if you take a historic building, in Greenwich, and somebody looks at it and a developer says, I can tear that building down and build something for a lower cost than it would take to restore that historic building to its former luster. And so the federal government has a program that says, well, we'll kick in 20%, a 20% tax credit of all of your expenditures. And, they all tend to work this way. Solar will kick in 30%, so they're different percentages. But we'll kick in 20% if you'll, instead of tearing it down, you'll restore that building to its luster. And there are countless examples in communities where there were buildings that had fallen on hard times. And, the rejuvenation, the renovation of that building has truly infused energy into the whole community. And as a result, they can show that there's a lot of other economic development that takes place. So that's the bet that the government is making. So the developer has a conventional capital stack on that building, or even a solar project, where he's going to borrow 60% if he can, and he'd come up with 40% equity. But in this case, 20%, because that's a tax credit, is what we refer to as tax equity. So it's part of the equity stack, but instead it's actually coming from the tax credit. And so it subsidizes the equity that developer has to come up with. And if the program's effective, that subsidy was enough to make him renovate this building according to the code of the of how the federal government lays out the requirements for the historic rehabilitation, and it's been very successful in bridging that divide. If the developer could use the tax credit, they would, because then it's just a dollar for dollar offset. But most guys can't, so they come to firms like us, and there are a lot of folks that do this, and ask us to bring investors into that project to effectively acquire that tax credit. And it's a fairly simple transaction where, those tax credits will trade for 85 or 90 cents on the dollar. So if it's 90 cents, then somebody is in a $10 million renovation. We've got a $2 million tax credit. Investor is buying $2 million to offset their tax liability for $1.8 million. And in addition, they're now a partner in that project. They're going to get some preferred cash flows and actually have a long-term stake in the project. And so when you add all that up, the way to think about these projects from a return standpoint is that you basically take $1 of tax liability and you convert it into about $1.20. So as we always say, compared to lots of investment opportunities, the investment opportunities these guys are talking about, you'd never make that trade. But compared to paying the government, it's a pretty good trade, because that's your alternative here. You can pay your taxes, or you can invest in these projects. And so that really leads to, okay, well, then why isn't everybody doing it? And that leads to then what are really the risks around this sort of investing? And the nice thing about these programs is that they've created a set of rules that's really pretty easy to color between the lines. So we're putting solar panels up. The solar panels have to produce energy. They have to be connected. There are ownership transfer prohibitions. We renovate the historic building. We can't tear it down in year 3 and put up a modern building. They're pretty intuitive, common sense type regulations. Affordable housing, obviously the people actually living there have to meet the affordable housing tests for income. And as long as you meet those tests, that's really just program compliance. You get your tax credit. And as a result, this is pretty standard stuff. The tax credit industry is about a $20 billion a year industry. There are fewer than 1% of the credits that ever get forfeited because, again, it's pretty easy. Now, the cash flows and the stake that you have in the project, obviously that is subject to project risk. But the nice thing about the tax credit world is that the project doesn't have to succeed. It can go, the guy who renovated the building was wrong. He couldn't get a successful restaurant there, or couldn't get office rents. That project can go bankrupt. It doesn't affect the tax credit investor's return. So as we look at infrastructure and just tax reform in general, there's this question of, well, will these tax credits remain on the books? Will there be an infrastructure tax credit? And our answer is obviously who knows, just like everybody else's answer. But I think that when you look at the history and the growth of tax credits, it's really back to this bipartisan concept. The reason tax credits in our minds have grown rapidly is because for Democrats, they have been a useful tool to achieve public policies that have been sort of near and dear to a lot of the Democratic agenda. But for Republicans, it's still a free market way to solve those. And in the case of affordable housing, we can all think about the bad old days of when the government used to build these terrible affordable housing complexes that, were disasters. And now you have the private market doing it, and they're doing a much better job. And that's true with solar. It's true with low-income community investing. So where there continues to be a capital gap, where there are infrastructure projects that aren't, say, an airport where it makes economic sense to privatize an airport and there can simply be a non-governmental exchange there, where there needs to be some type of support. Tax credits can help bridge that gap, and for investors, again, it can be an interesting part of the capital structure to play in with a very different type of risk-adjusted return profile.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you very much. I think it's time for questions. If people have questions for any of our panelists. Ed?
On the tax credits, how does, so if I get a tax credit, is it a stream of payments, or does it just occur in the year that the project goes into service?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So they have different types of programs. So in the case of, I mentioned solar and the building that you rehabilitate, those are one-year credits. You get the credit all up front when the solar project is complete. And so that's great because you can look at your tax liability that year. So a lot of individuals like those credits because individuals obviously have fluctuating tax liability. So they'll look at their liability that year and they can make the investment and get the credit in the same year. In the case of affordable housing and the low-income community tax credit is called the New Markets Credit. In the case of those are long-range, multi-year credits, 7, 10, 15 years. While, again, it's still a blank slate, to the extent that an infrastructure credit is modeled after the existing tax credit programs, we would guess that it's likely to be a multi-year, long-range credit because that better matches up to the types of projects. State credits tend to be instantaneous, 1 year. You don't become a partner, you're just buying them at a discount, so you buy $1 state liability for 80 cents. Those probably will remain, 1-year credits, but at the federal level, it's probably a multi-year credit.
In the back?
Yeah, again, on tax credits, when you buy a tax credit, what do you give? You get a stock certificate, a promissory note, or a form included with your tax return?
Yeah.
What kind of evidence of the investment?
Yeah, you actually get a K-1, so you actually become a member in the LLC. That is the Project LLC or a fund that we drop down into the Project LLC. And so you'll actually get a credit that shows up on that K-1 that then goes onto a line on your tax return that's just, below the line, you owe this. It's just a dollar-for-dollar offset on that.
In the corner?
For the energy guys, any feelings about the Canadian oil sands business? And I guess that creeps down into the politics as well. What do you think?
You can talk about it.
In terms of the oil sands, generally, if you look at break-even returns for the producer, the oil sands tend to have higher break-evens, less economic than other sources, particularly given new techniques for finding oil in this case. It's brought the curve down so much in terms of the cost of developing oil in other ways other than the oil sands that it's hard for them to be competitive. And then not only that, there's a lot of environmental and other issues with just that it takes a tremendous amount of energy to create oil from the sands themselves. So there's a lot of other issues, but the economics just make it a tougher and tougher business.
Okay.
Infrastructure sounds so easy, but I think there's a lot of misnomers in the business. Big deviation between sort of perception and reality.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, continue on the energy side, what are some projects that you just really would not want to get involved in, perhaps building oil sands or build a new coal-fired power plant? And what are some areas that are, particularly attractive going forward? You mentioned microgrids.
Yeah.
So I'll pick that up. I think, one of the things when I first started my career, I came in to clean up the first generation of funds at my former firm. So one good thing about learning, when you're cleaning up mess after mess, you learn a lot about risk profile. And I think the way Mark outlined it, and I've had a similar view for a long time, is when you think about those revenue streams, that's kind of been the key lesson for infrastructure. You're looking for revenues that are either contracted, regulated, or you have a geographic monopoly. Now, when you overlay that with sector pieces, and you think about threats that are coming out, buying a rail network that hauls, coal to the East Coast to ship to Europe is not going to necessarily be a long-term play. And that's just fitting into an issue that's currently existing in Germany. So the revenue piece, people have got wrong over time. As we come towards the back end of each cycle, we see people drift again. We saw things that were defined as infrastructure, and Mark and I were both in industry at the time, where competitive car parking in Manhattan and other big cities was viewed as infrastructure. That is a property play. Now it's what's highest and best use for that airspace. That's different to an entire monopoly over a higher state university. So a revenue piece has been a really good guiding light. I think where there are real challenges, where microgrids, we see a lot of opportunity to get around to take value off the utilities. We see a lot of opportunity in the US across airports. I mean, there are 130 airports in the United States with more than 1 million passengers a year. I love walking through airports. I pull my phone out, I grab a sandwich, and if I can take more than 2 bites without wanting to throw it in the bin, I'm amazed. Right? I can't even get the basic Pret sandwich I can get in T5 at Heathrow. So we think, if we said what are our big verticals at the moment, we really like transportation infrastructure through airports. We like the opportunity to bring technology and infrastructure to deliver better customer outcomes on water and combined sewer and outflow systems. We're doing a lot of work, as no doubt Mark is, around microgrids and how you do distributed energy as a big theme. We have a similar view to Mark across working with how do you actually do energy infrastructure in a contracted way across major basins. We see those things that we get nervous about. Build us a new road that hasn't existed before. And I've got one of those scar tissues down my back. But that is really difficult. Some of the assets still need to be state development assets. And the thing that we've witnessed, and I played a big role in this in Sydney between 2012 and 16, was the government came up with this plan, which is why asset recycling gets such a lot of discussion. They said, what do we need to build that the community really needs, but there's not commercial revenue streams? And what do we actually have that we shouldn't be in the business of? And they basically went through the desalination facility, all the ports, all the utilities, and said, we're really not good at those businesses. But what we do need to build is we need to build new heavy rail. We need to build out road network. We need to build out regional water. And so kind of recycling existing infrastructure into new was what they did. But big 3 points, revenue risk profile is key, and it gets stretched at the back of a cycle, as does. We've seen less stress on the leverage side this cycle, but that was last cycle. And then, existing opportunities where you can deliver a better outcome than government, we quite find on the public side. I'll let you pick up the private side of infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think for us, as we think about it, we want businesses where we can have strong contractual frameworks and everything else, but we want the underlying economics of that business to be strong going into the future. So I'll give you a couple examples of business we want to avoid. Anything, I actually think tax credits in the U.S. is quite different, but in a lot of other countries, there have been subsidy regimes put in place that ultimately become uneconomic for the government to keep in place, and then we've seen governments change those. And so if you need a big subsidy, the underlying economics of the business doesn't really work without that subsidy, that can be dangerous in terms of a long-term investment in that infrastructure. So you think about, and then just the underlying economic shifts of what's going on. So coal is an area where basically natural gas and renewables is replacing coal, not just in the United States, but around the world. So to invest in a coal facility right now would be very, very difficult for us. We could think long and hard about it, but the underlying economics have to really work, and the economics are shifting away from coal. Nuclear is a very tough place to invest. Huge capital costs. in order to put it in place. It's very carbon friendly. It has some advantages, but it's just tough. So I think oil sands is an area where it'd be very hard for us to invest in infrastructure that's working with oil sands because the economics there are tough generally. So in terms of new areas, I think renewables are key. This whole natural gas value chain, I didn't get into it in a lot of detail, but there is a lot of opportunity there. We are looking for investable opportunities in storage, electricity storage. There's really not great ways to store electricity that are cheap and readily available. That's changing. The cost curve in storage is coming down dramatically. That could be an opportunity for us. Microgrids, some of the other things, distributed energy, those are things that are becoming more economic, more rational, and therefore could be good long-term investments for us.
Just Asia infrastructure, very interesting. China's very ambitious about their plans in Southeast Asia and Central Asia. Are there any opportunities for investors to make money in that stuff?
We've made some investments in Asia. Typically, what we've done, though, is we've followed major international energy companies into the space. And so when we have contracts for revenues, those contracts are with big oil companies or big other energy producers in the region. So we're not really faced with the sovereign risk that one would worry about. Investing into China or India or places like that where there have been very fast changes in the way they regulate businesses, that's scary. So where we've invested in some of the more emerging markets has been basically with big companies in the energy space as our counterparties where there's a strong economic rationale for whatever that infrastructure is, and we're avoiding the whole issue in terms of sovereign risk. Or if there is a sovereign risk, I'll give you one example. We do have ships, these FPSOs that are collecting oil in Malaysia off the coast of Vietnam, but our contracts are with major international oil companies in U.S. dollars because it's a U.S. dollar business globally. And we can actually, if you worry about expropriation or hurricanes or other things like that, it's actually very inexpensive to insure against those types of risks. So we try to figure out what's the whole risk profile, how do we button down every risk possible. In that kind of example, you can actually button down a lot of the risks quite well, even though you're in a country that might be a different type of place to invest.
John?
So you exit at a period of length of time about two times what a private equity person would be. Can you speak to some of the risks in the exits that we might not have talked about, and taking into context that the government you transacted with will probably be a very different government with which you exit with, as well as dynamics in your own firm and the like, and maybe to compare what the answer to that is in the United States versus overseas?
You want me to pick that up?
Yeah, please.
So I think that's it's a key point. It comes up through the question that was asked earlier around capital formation. So when you do, and there's largely two different worlds when you're dealing with kind of private infrastructure versus public infrastructure. And the key, and I've exited quite a lot of public infrastructure over time. There's a couple of key facets that you've got to look through. What we've learned over those periods of early on, having had some difficult exits where you'd come through, you had to get a change of control consent. The government looked at it and said, hang on, you just made 3 times your money? That's a very difficult conversation when the service hadn't really improved. A lesson, and that was 10 plus years ago. What we very much look at now, and it's in the capital formation, is how do we come in where we're in control, but more our long-term partners are kind of in up front, and they want the longer range. We can take the highly kind of profitable period, the early transformation period. So then when we do exit, we're exiting out to long-term partners. That means we don't trigger the change of control, and in fact, right up front on the deal, we've introduced long-term partners. So whether that's Texas Teachers or the government of Singapore or ADIA or someone similar, they know who's in there long-term on day one. We're in there for a period, and they respect that we've got to make a return for our expertise. And that comes from some lessons from the 1990s through to 2000s. The second thing, when you think about exit, this is very similar to a private equity business as well. If your private equity business is performing poorly on customer satisfaction, margins, it's usually not a great time to exit. In infrastructure, if you're performing poorly on your customer satisfaction, your underlying economics are not working out, you're not delivering outcomes, it's not a good time to exit. So we've usually found, in that scenario, setting up the capital formation early to accommodate the exit and the long-term hold, positioning the business with government to make sure that we're outperforming our agreed key performance indicators. You've given them some upside on that. Allows for a far more effective conversation and efficient conversation through exit. We have a rule that we have, which is do not embarrass government. The quickest way to get the industry shut down is to embarrass government. Do it in a very considered fashion and on a whole lot of fronts.
And just to add one point to that, a different flavor on what Pete was saying. A lot of what we try to do structurally is create long-term dividend yields, so about half your return actually comes just from cash flow as you're sitting in the asset. That helps de-risk exit. Also, if you can use your cash flow to de-lever over time, that creates equity value. That helps protect you in terms of a better exit. And then obviously, if you can find ways to enhance businesses over time, like Pete was alluding to, and get some growth, that also is something that is offensive you can do to create better exits. People in our space definitely worry about what if interest rates go up, or there's less demand. There seems like a voracious demand in the markets, certainly for the foreseeable future, for infrastructure projects, given the characteristics of trying to create defensive returns, but also some offensive returns as well.
And the other point I'd add, and it's always interesting being inside a private equity firm, and they'll say, okay, you'll get your best exit through a control premium, Pete. Why do you want to give up control and exit a minority? I said, I keep very close to all the pensions, large pension sovereigns and insurers globally, because they're natural exits. We want to know what they want to buy, to Mark's point. None of them actually want control. And if you actually track back through a lot of infrastructure trades over the last decade and recent ones, the biggest multiples have been paid for minority transactions. Because what they don't want to be is they don't want to be Ardia's, I'm just going to pick on Ardia, I know John McCarthy and the Ardia folks well, but Ardia's Colonial Pipeline has a leak, or CDPQ's Colonial Pipeline has a leak. They don't want that headline. No. They just want to be able to stand behind the masses. So you do see this dynamic where if you set up the right risk profile, right relationship, right scenario, they will pay up a multiple that you just won't see in a controlled transaction.
I think we have time for one more. Go ahead.
So, Mark, you talked about nat gas a couple of times, and there's been considerable excitement about U.S. as an exporter of LNG. I'm assuming to the extent that you've participated, you've got the contracted cash flows and all that. So how do you think about beyond that, now that you may be involved, about the risks in the space, and then how do you think about maybe doing more, because it is quite a big trend?
In the natural gas space overall?
Yeah, in the natural gas.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of investable opportunities around this, and just maybe give you some examples. We think natural gas is going to be really cheap for a long, long time in the United States. It's incredibly plentiful, easy to tap into, and is certainly cleaner than coal and a better alternative in many, many respects. So how can you invest behind that? Well, we've invested in a very large natural gas power plant in northeast Pennsylvania, where there is basically amongst the cheapest natural gas available in the country. We invested in a gas local distribution company. We're in 4 states, and what people are doing is, in Connecticut, I get deliveries of fuel oil and propane to my house by truck. Well, if you have a pipe that goes into your home or your commercial and industrial facility, it's cheaper, cleaner, more reliable than relying on certainly propane or fuel oil. So there's a lot of switching going on, where we can get a nice regulated return with these local distribution companies, at the same time get growth. Moving away from the shores of the United States, there's still massive investment going on. I know, Pete, you played in this space, in creating export facilities for natural gas. We invested also in a pipeline that's bringing that natural gas into Mexico, a major trunk line for Texas gas, basically, moving throughout Mexico. Then there are the ships that actually transport that gas. And then there are the import terminals on the other side in different parts of the world that need a lot of capital. So there is tens and tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars that need to still be expended as this trend grows. So I don't know if that hits your...
Yeah, no, that's helpful. There's a lot of capital flowing into the space, too.
There is.
So that creates some risks, and I wonder how you think about that. At what point do the returns diminish? Are there exogenous things that come in that impact what you're doing there?
There's no doubt there's a wall of capital that's interested in the space, and it's not just folks like us, but also sovereigns and others that are very interested in investing in the space. The thing that we focus on is how do we add value, and that rather than just being a source of capital, how can we actually add value? And so I'll give you an example. We've had 2 or 3 portfolio companies where we want to build a solar portfolio or a wind portfolio. We team up with a developer that is really good at developing projects, but they may not have all the capital to actually execute. And so we had one example of a company that we teamed up with. They would build 2 or 3 utility-scale solar projects, and then they would get them done, and then try to sell them so they could recirculate the capital into the next set of projects. We committed $150 million to support them. That allowed them to not just do 4 projects at a time, but 10 projects at a time, because they knew the capital was going to be there when these projects were being constructed. They had that certainty, and so that capital certainty allowed them to build. We built 21 projects in 18 months. It was a massive acceleration in the growth of their business. So we have to find ways. We have companies that want to be more asset light. A big company called Petrofac, and it's based in London. They provide energy services around the globe. What we did is we looked at their balance sheet. We said, you own all this infrastructure. Why do you want it? Let's us own it in a joint venture. We'll recirculate capital into your business so you can invest in high returning endeavors for your company going forward. So there has to be a strategy, a value add, something different than just money.
Okay, we could go on and on. This is so interesting to me. We started talking about a master plan and how the master plan is not necessary. The municipalities are moving ahead. The green shoots are coming from the local areas, which is a hopeful scenario. Thank you very much, speakers. You did a superb job educating us. I also wanted to thank Connie House Connect, who's done a tremendous amount on this panel and in general for the Greenwich Roundtable. She's our rock, so thank you very much. Sunil Khanna is probably the person to thank the most. He's the one who came up with the idea of this panel. Brian Furtado, excellent. Thank you very much for helping with our speakers. Caitlin Brody, tremendous. Thank you for getting Glenn to come and then having Pete come at the last minute. She looks very calm in the corner over there. And then Dave Paulson was super helpful, as was Boris Rakin. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Just a little housekeeping before we go. We're going to be here on November 16th. Peter Lawrence has put together a fantastic session on blockchain and cyber assets. And thank you, Peter. This ought to be a good one. It was a packed room. Yesterday, Michael Castine was telling us this subject in New York. Just to echo a couple of things, it's great to be the group historian. To echo Pete Taylor's comments on the aviation industry, if you look at a PBS series that's out right now called City in the Sky, apparently there's at any one given point in time there are 1 million people in the air, and it just goes over the entire aviation infrastructure around the world. It's fascinating. It'll put Pete's comments into context. Being the group historian, I have to say, Mark, your colleague or your former colleague sat here on the dais in 1998 and said, natural gas is a North American commodity, and it's not an attractive investment.
Things change.
It's good to see your firm's not dogmatic like that. That's amazing. He also said oil people are usually geologists, and they just love to punch holes in the ground, and we try to avoid that. So how things change. And finally,
It's going to be quoted in 10, 20 years.
exactly. We're recording this if you haven't already known that. But I do want to do a shout out to someone who's in the investor education business and educating trustees and LPs all over the country, primarily in the endowment area. But she's also our state senator, and she's operating in a political supermajority in the state that's largely got the state of Connecticut into an uneconomic position. Senator Tony Boucher, would you raise your hand, please? There she is. Thank you. She's bringing fiscal discipline to Connecticut. She's reaching across the aisle, and we might have some resolution if she gets her way. So, Tony, thank you very much. And most importantly, I want to thank Ryan. It's good to see Ryan back in the saddle organizing these sessions again. So, good job. And fellas, very good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.